either way, we will be here fighting. Whatever comes, there are people fighting. There are tenants' rights attorneys. There are council members. There are commissioners who are here to say this is not affordable enough. I mean, there are people who are fighting, but it is important to have the right people in office.
That was Leah Goodridge, a commissioner on the New York City Planning Commission. And this is Epicenter NYC. We connect our communities to news, information, and each other. I'm your host, Amber Castillo. With the incoming Trump administration, a lot of uncertainty looms for New Yorkers who rely on federal housing assistance, like Section 8. Potential changes to affordable housing policy could significantly impact many families, particularly in a city as diverse and dependent on federal support as New York. So how can tenants prepare themselves for the challenges ahead? Today, I sit down with Leah Goodridge to learn more about the implications of HUD's proposed changes, including controversial ideas from Project 2025 that could reshape housing support in New York City and nationwide. Leah brings years of experience as a tenants' rights attorney and a deep understanding of how these policies impact the everyday lives of New Yorkers. Before we jump in, a quick message from our team.
Hi, I'm Mariana from the Epicenter NYC team. Did you know that anxiety, sleep problems, and muscle pain could be symptoms of long COVID? Take the steps needed to protect yourself, your family, and your plants. Get vaccinated against COVID-19. We can help you schedule your appointment and even arrange your ride there. Email us at hello@epicenter-nyc.com or call or text us at 917-818-2690.
Now back to the show. Here's my conversation with Leah.
My full name is Leah Goodridge, and my title is Commissioner on the New York City Planning Commission.
With this incoming Trump administration, what changes would you say New Yorkers who rely on Section 8 in their rent or housing options, what changes might some New Yorkers need to prepare for?
So the main thing to think about is that the federal government branch, which is HUD, is the one that funds a lot of the affordable housing and also creates a lot of the rules around some local affordable housing. And when it comes to Section 8, when it comes to public housing, they are proposing some rules that would affect those tenants. For example, they would like to minimize the housing trust, which funds a lot of the affordable housing. So it's not clear yet if that happens, what will the actual impact be on the local level? For example, New York City might chip in and say, well, we'll fund that portion, but I don't know. And I should just say that I am one of 13 commissioners on the City Planning Commission. I don't work for the mayor. I work for the city, but I am speaking in my own capacity. And so I truly don't know what will happen with budgets with affordable housing. But I do know, as someone who has fought for tenants many years before becoming a commissioner, how this might impact tenants. So the main thing to think about is the funding part. Some other portions that they would like to change, there's a lot of language in Project 2025. There's a chapter specifically written by Dr. Ben Carson, yes, that Ben Carson, about HUD. A lot of the language is about workforce and about how the current system, they view it as they call it anti-family. And so their version, or the way that they're looking at this, is that public benefits right now prevents women from marrying men and having families because they're relying on the government for help. And this is a very old, false trope. It's very, if folks know about the 1965 Moynihan report, I mean, this is just, things that I don't agree with, but it's just another form of blaming people for being poor, and another form of saying, get out of poverty, bootstraps talk. So there's a lot of workforce development talk about, you have to get a job. And so I think that we might see a lot more of that.
If the Trump administration changes who qualifies for housing help, and because of that, New Yorkers get priced out Are there certain resources that they should be looking into or other forms of support?
Before I answer that, I wanted to say is one other change is that they would like to make it so that what they call non-citizens, you cannot have mixed status families. So if you have a family that lives in an apartment that is under a Section 8 voucher or public housing, and one person is undocumented, but everyone else has legal status, then that would not be allowed. So that that was a lot of my clients. That was a lot of my clients. I mean, this is just New York is a city of immigrants, and this is very common. And so that will be something that people should be cautious of about the incoming administration, because again, HUD is the federal government and they make a lot of the determinations on the local level. And then they create funding that is tied to those that eligibility criteria. So, I'm here to present the information of what they're saying, but who knows how things will shake out. But I think that it's important for people to know what's being said and what the so-called plans are.
The city also has some affordable housing projects in the works, even though, like, I think you pointed out in some of your posts that affordability sometimes refers to studios over $3,000 a month. But how could actual affordable housing projects be in jeopardy if HUD's budget gets slashed or gets changed?
I mean, one of the things that I have raised is our current structure right now of housing is very much reliant on private developers to build a lot of the housing. And then the affordability part, the government chips in to provide a portion of it. It's not a ton, but some would say that 25 to 30% is a ton. But to me, when half of those are not even affordable, or $3,000 for a studio, I don't really think that that's a ton. And I say that as a commissioner because I speak up about this quite frequently when we see it. I think what will likely happen is we will have more of the city pitch in for a lot of the developments. But the reason why I brought up the private sector taking over is that there's already been an over-reliance on the private sector anyway to fund affordability and to fund housing in the first place. So we may have, I mean, this is just my guess, but this isn't anything that I'm saying that it's based on, because all of this is they're still saying Project 2025 isn't a real thing. And so I am operating as if it is. And a lot of housing advocates are operating as if it is to provide people with information. And I just want to say for folks out there, I know that this might be, well, it is. It is a very anxiety-inducing time. It is for me as well. I won't lie. Here are some tips that I want to give folks, because as I mentioned before, I practice as a tenants' rights attorney. And under the first Trump administration, there are definitely some changes that I saw with public housing, with Section 8. One of the main changes is I think sometimes whatever the federal administration is, their culture tends to seep down on the local level. So sometimes the PHAs, the public housing authorities, they get a little bit more stringent. So one of the things I want people to keep in mind is the very small and what I would consider small and minor infractions. Those are the ones that they ramp up a bit under administrations like these. So for example, family changes. If you have a new member to your household, like your niece is coming to visit you from North Carolina for 6 months, tell the PHA about that. These are just things that people aren't trying to hide anything. It's just like life changes and they haven't informed like NYCHA or whoever yet. And then they find out. And then suddenly it's like, you're up for termination because you didn't tell us that your niece was here for a month or whatever it was. So I want folks to know that sometimes when you hear that, it seems very petty and small, like, oh, they're not going to do that. But I've seen it. So things like household changes, like who lives in your household. And sometimes people don't want to report this because it might mean that their rent changes because whoever it is, whatever their income is, if they haven't income, it might mean a change in the household. But the point is, it's better to report than not because it could lead to termination. The other small change is income changes. Like if you have a change in your income, report it. So I just want folks to know that now is the time to really be to really stick to the rules, even if they are minor or they sound petty.
Oh, those are really helpful tips. And because you had mentioned the reliance on private funding for a while for some of this, the affordable housing, yeah, I'm curious. So if the Trump administration cuts funding, could we see more NYCHA buildings being sold to developers?
Well, that is actually a part of the Project 2025 for across the nation to make it easier for public housing to be sold to private enterprises. I mean, essentially, they have a lot in Project 2025 where they want to privatize basically the federal government. This would be part of it, where it's government becomes very small and private companies, the private sector takes over and does what we would expect a government to do and make money while they're doing it. And we already know who is going to benefit from this and who isn't. A working class is not going to benefit from that.
And is there anything you could say about how likely the new administration would be to make changes to housing tax credits?
What I can say is this is why it's really important to make sure that when we are voting for whoever is going to be the mayor, your city council member, that you ensure that folks have a housing platform and you know what it is. So we want to know what their thoughts are on rent stabilized housing, what their thoughts are on public housing, and specifically, do they believe that they should protect rent stabilized housing? A lot of people don't. A lot of politicians don't. They believe they're against rent stabilization. New York City itself was sued by landlords recently. I was a part of a lawsuit because I was on the New York City Rent Guidelines Board challenging rent stabilization. And this has happened multiple times. And so it almost went to the Supreme Court, and Justice Thomas, threw the landlords a bone and said, bring it back. So this is a real threat. And the wrong mayor, the wrong governor could be really disastrous. And also the wrong city council member, because you can also have city council members who have influence, right? And rent stabilization is a state, but still, these are things that we should know. Public housing, what are their thoughts on funding public housing? Do they believe that public housing should be funded or protected? Or are they putting their energy into social housing, which is something entirely different, but not public housing? Because you also don't want, this is my personal perspective, you want politicians who value public housing, but don't see, a lot of people do the cop out. They are aware that public housing is connected with class, with race. And so they do this sort of cop out where they're like, oh, let's just try to fund housing for everyone. And it's like, how are you going to do that? But then you're also claiming that you don't have enough money to fund public housing. So why are we putting a lot of focus on there? Which, if we could have funding for everyone, that's great. But when I hear that, and then also in the same breath say that we don't have enough funding for NYCHA, then I wonder where we're going to get this funding from. So these are questions that you want to ask.
And is there anything you could say about public-private partnerships and whether those could help if federal funding dries up for some of these programs?
I mean, I think we're already seeing it at the commission level. And I don't want to be doom and gloom, but my personal perspective, I'm a tenant myself. I'm one of the few, I think I'm one of two tenants on the City Planning Commission. I was the only one at the time on the Rent Guidelines Board, born and raised in Brooklyn. And so for me, I do get to see the impact of the privatization of housing. And I don't look at it as a savior. I'll just say that and call it a day. I mean, either way, we will be here fighting. Whatever comes, there are people fighting. There are tenants' rights attorneys. There are council members. There are commissioners who are here to say, this is not affordable enough. I mean, there are people who are fighting, but it is important to have the right people in office.
For New Yorkers who haven't been part of this fight right now, what can they do, especially with the incoming Trump administration and all the concerns around that? How can they get involved and fight beyond being an informed voter?
You need to call the mayor's office and let them, because this is where a lot of the New York City and then the federal part, this is where this is a lot of this is going to kind of come to a head. Because, a lot of the city council members are already pushing the mayoral administration, right? And so a lot of the housing plans, City of Yes, for example, that's a mayoral housing plan. So you need to let your voice be heard.
You spoke about doom and gloom. Is there anything that gives you hope for affordable housing in New York City right now?
I think for now, I've realized that people know the situation, but they don't really know. And I sort of took that for granted. So for myself, I have been using my platforms to inform people, hey, when they say affordable housing, they actually mean $3,000 studios in Brooklyn. And people are like, what? So I have been using my platforms to talk about that. And what I've realized is the more that people are aware and the more you arm them with knowledge, then they have something to go to their council member or the mayor about to be more clear to say, you said you're building affordable housing, but it's $3,000 studios, and I don't agree with that. And so that gives me a lot of hope because I'm realizing that information is power.
Thank you so much, Leah. Stay informed, stay engaged, and remember that your voice matters. Whether it's calling your representatives, attending community meetings, or simply spreading the word. For more in-depth coverage on housing issues in New York City, visit epicenter-nyc.com/category/housing. And if you know of a local business that you think Epicenter should feature, let us know. Drop us a note at hello@epicenter-nyc.com. That's all for today. Thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting us as we do our best to support our community. We couldn't do it without you. For more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at epicenter-nyc.com. Our intro music is All the Pretty Horses by Karavika. You can find more of their music on their website, linked to in our podcast description.